Okay. Okay. Huh. Hmm. Hmm. If that's a good point, Heath. That's a real good point where you have these characteristics of God's nature, just his character, right? And we can make a list of what those things are. God is love. God is just. God is gracious. God is creative. God is all knowing. God is all powerful, right? If God is all powerful, then couldn't he just say, I forgive sins? But if you have all of these different things that all have to be equally and completely satisfied for God to still be who he is, well, for God to both be just and merciful at the same time, something extreme has to happen. If you have a situation, this is how Keller breaks it down. I think this is a good example because I think a lot of this series is wonderful because it gives us tools in our toolbox, right? When we have these conversations with somebody, when somebody, whether that's somebody you work with or when your kids, somebody asks these questions, it's good to have some knowledge and good to say, I have an idea of how I would answer this really good question. The first thing Keller says is that real forgiveness is costly suffering. Real forgiveness is costly suffering. Now, I think we can all reflect on a situation where we have had to forgive someone else, or someone has had something real significant to forgive us for, right? If Jenna sends me to the grocery store and tells me to pick up eggs, which I can't do right now anyway, but let's say the grocery store had eggs. We go and I forget the eggs, right? That's not a real big thing for her to forgive me for. But we've all had those situations where we have something big that someone is going to forgive us, needs to forgive us for, or we have something big to forgive someone else for. And letting go of something, true forgiveness of some great pain or injustice, hurts. But who does it hurt? The forgiver, right? There is a suffering in forgiving. Now, our other option is to just hold on to it, right? And what the old saying is, bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? Or holding a grudge. Like, if I don't forgive, what does that do? Well, it just creates this cycle of retribution where maybe I seek vengeance and so I hurt them back. And okay, we've balanced the pain, but most of the time, how does somebody respond to retribution? Well, they're vengeful back, and it just creates this big cycle. But if we're going to stop that cycle of retribution and vengeance, somebody's got to be forgiving and saying, I am carrying the weight of this pain. I'm carrying the weight of this wrongdoing right now, and I'm just going to keep carrying it. I'm not going to transfer it back to that other person, and that's suffering. If you've ever truly had to forgive someone very deeply, you know that hurts to hold on and say, I forgive you, and I'm going to let go of this. I'm going to just let this end and die with me. And if we can understand that in our own personal small human lives, how much more true is it for God, who created his beings, who created his world, and then they wronged him and they rebelled from him and they rejected him over and over and over. And there's so much weight. There's so much just pain and just weight in that. And for God to say, I'm going to forgive that, I'm going to let it go, there had to be suffering involved to let it go. I mean, Heath, kind of like you said, right? It just is what it is. Like, for God to forgive us, there had to be some sort of suffering involved, because any real forgiveness involves suffering on the part of the forgiver. Does that make sense? Well, can we understand that how it works in our life? How much more true is it for God? And Keller brings up the idea of confrontation. Well, what about confrontation? If I'm going to forgive somebody for doing wrong to me, does that mean that I don't confront them or I don't hold them accountable? No, of course. But that confrontation that we do toward one another, and that, of course, God does towards us, always has the purpose, if we're doing it right, if we're doing it with God's attitude, it has that purpose of healing. It has that purpose, or it's rooted in love, rooted in reconciliation, of making things right and making things whole again. Now, what's so crucial, and I think if we're explaining really basic Christian theology to someone who doesn't get it, or who doesn't know. When we have this idea, and this was one thing that Keller brought up, just kind of an interesting way that I've never really thought of it this way, but he says he hears this from time to time as he interacts with non-believers. He said that when you have this theology, you have this teaching, right, of you have God sends his son, and his son violently dies for the sins of humanity. He says, I've heard sometimes that people ask, why is that not like child sacrifice? Why is that not, what parent would allow their child to die? Isn't that kind of cruel to use that imagery to explain it in that way? And Keller says one of the really basic tenets of Christianity is that we believe that Jesus, and this is very fundamental and very unique about Christianity, is that Jesus isn't just the Son of God, but the Father and the Son are one. Right? This is something that Jesus says in the end of the last couple chapters of John when he's praying and spending time with his disciples, right? He says, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, and we are one, right? So when you have this theology of the Father sends his Son and the Son dies, it's not exactly like you have an unwilling child being just thrown to the wolves, but we believe that Jesus is God. That Jesus was both mysteriously, both fully human, but also fully divine. And that's mysterious. If anyone wants to take a stab at explaining that, that's another good one. But I think that's crucial when we try to explain this to other people, is that Jesus was fully God. This wasn't just Jesus going to die on the Father's behalf, but it's God choosing to die himself. Does that make sense? A little mysterious there. Yes, sir.
Well, I was going to say that I think there, like he said, there's a lot of it we don't comprehend. But there are two parts I think that we can all think about and understand to some degree, and that is, in the Old Testament, people sinned and they were punished in some fashion. You can name different things that happened. Jonah ran from God, so he suffered by being in a fish. He was swallowed by fish. But then he was rescued. And other things, like the captivity, Babylonian captivity, God's people were made slaves. They had to endure mistreatment, hard labor, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we understand that not doing God's will, there's going to be consequences. But then, God put his plan into action, the plan of salvation, where they used the worst kind of torture, I guess, they had at the time, which was, I don't know how long crucifixion had been used, but it was used for a long time. But for the worst kind of criminal. So now, how can we make a substitute salvation that would be beyond, you can't go beyond it. No superlative to that. With the perfect man, God-man, on the cross, died awful death. And that can't be surpassed. That's, for that day and age, the worst.
So it would, Robert, if I understand what you're saying, and I'm with you on it, for that example to be made, right? That example of God has this supreme forgiveness, and the forgiver is going to suffer in some way for taking on that debt, taking on and carrying the weight of that wrongdoing, that injustice. What more full, at least at that time, or maybe for all time, what fuller example of suffering for the sins of humanity than both this excruciating, violent death on the cross and everything else that went with this, and then Heath, what you brought on as well, right? The emotional, the spiritual weight of taking on the sins of humanity, just like Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, right? For our sin, he was made sin. He who is without sin was made sin. And that forsakenness, the Father from the Son, what more full way to exemplify what God was going through and what he chose to go through to settle that debt. But one of the things that Keller brings up in this chapter is the violent death of Jesus on the cross. The crucifixion is not just an example. It's not just a visual example so that we would understand, but it's something that was necessary to be done to actually settle the debt, to actually settle the score, I guess you'd say, and actually forgive the wrongs. Have we all been in those situations where we have said, I forgive you for what you've done, but you don't really forgive them for what they've done, right? You say, oh, I forgive you because I don't feel like arguing right now. We'll just move on, but I'm going to bring this up again later, right? That's one of the things that 1 Corinthians 13 talks about, right? When he's describing all the different things that love is. The one that always gets me is love keeps no record of wrongs. I'm like, oh, scratch that one. I don't like that one, you know? But if our God, Heath, going back to what you said, right? That's the character, that's the nature of God, that is loving, to actually forgive the debt, to actually get rid of the debt. Somebody had to pay it. Someone had to pay it because, again, our God is completely just as well. And that had to be satisfied. Otherwise, God would no longer be what He claims to be, which is just. And that brings us to the second thing that Keller points out. He says that real love is a personal exchange. Have you ever had a situation before? The technical term for this is transference. In relationships, right? You know what transference is? I wish Ben Elizondo was here. As a doctor, he could give us a really good explanation of what transference is. It's when you're working with somebody and you want to stay emotionally distant, right? This is somebody who's struggling with something in life, or it's a doctor-patient relationship where the doctor is the healer and the patient's the one who's sick, and the doctor comes in and says, I'm just here to treat your ailments. I treat what you got, and then I'm going to walk away. And we are no longer emotionally connected. Well, transference is the reality that if we're ever working with someone closely, whether that's in a medical sense or an emotional sense, a relational sense, there's going to be some emotional connection. We're going to transfer. Myra, you may be hurting, or I may be hurting, and I'm seeking counsel in you, right? You're going to get invested in my life. You're going to care about me because that's just the way it works. And so if God is really invested in us, if God is really emotionally connected to us, that transference is going to happen, where God becomes this personal exchange, where the weight and the burden and the pain of my sin, because He loves us so truly, and there is that personal exchange, my pain, my wrongdoing, that becomes His too. And He shares in that. Keller brings this up. He calls it the substitutional sacrifice, which goes back to what you were saying, Robert. If you have a copy of the book, there's this really great quote from John Scott. It's on page 202. He says, the essence of sin, you got to listen to this. This is kind of deep here. The essence of sin is we human beings substituting ourselves for God. I want to be God, right? That goes back to Genesis, right? Where the serpent says, if you eat this fruit, you will become like God. So the essence of sin is we human beings substituting ourselves for God, while the essence of salvation is God substituting Himself for us. We put ourselves where only God deserves to be. And God puts Himself where only we deserve to be. Man, I read that. I was like, that's just what you said earlier, Bill, that, man, I'm honored. I'm touched. I'm appreciative. I'm relieved. But I also have a sense of guilt there as well, that God should not be responsible for doing that. But yet, because He so deeply, personally, relationally, emotionally, spiritually loves us, that personal exchange exists, where God feels and carries the weight of that as well. If you have your Bibles, Philippians 2, this will be the last thing we look at before we're out of time. Philippians 2, the wonderful, wonderful passage, very popular passage. Begin in verse 3. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Why? Why would I do that? He says, well, who's your example? Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped. Going back to what we said, right? God and Jesus, one. Jesus was God, but Jesus did not take that high and lofty position. He did not count that as something, equality with God was something to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So therefore, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's that perfect substitution, right? That Jesus was God, but did not keep his high and lofty seat, but chose to become man so that he could give himself up, not seeking his own glorification, expecting any glory or an honor, an exaltation, like he says at the end of this passage. That's going to come from the Father. He says, but I'm going to empty myself by being obedient to death on a cross. Why? Because that's the love that he had. That's that love and that humility, that exchange, that substitutional sacrifice, that God was willing to allow transference, willing to give himself up to help those that he truly loved. Keller calls this the great reversal, that God took our place so that we could become the righteousness of God. That it hurt him too, that he was willing to give up all of heaven and suffer right alongside with us. And this is the only way. This is the only way that God could be, and Heath, you must have read ahead. But this is that only way, right? That God could be both fully loving and merciful, but also fully just. That there was wrongdoing, there was sin, there was evil. And God can't tolerate evil. God can't be in the presence of evil. But yet there was evil. And that had to be taken care of. God had to do something about that. And the only way, and going back to what you said, Tim, the only way, because I can't do it, that it could be dealt with is for God to deal with it himself. And when we have those conversations with people, when they say, why? Why did Jesus have to die? Couldn't God just say, I forgive you? But because there was still that debt, there was still that presence of darkness and evil, and humanity can't take care of that. So who could do it? Only God could do it. And he was willing to pay that debt and blot out that darkness himself. Even though that came at a great cost and a great suffering and a great price. But any true forgiveness always has suffering involved for the forgiver. So there's more to this. There's more to unpack. Keep studying, keep digging, keep praying, having these conversations, and we will continue on. Next week's about the resurrection. So that's the other side of it. So why did he have to die? But then why did he have to raise from the grave as well? So stick with us. Like I said, we just got a couple weeks left of that. And thank you for being here. Stick around. If you're joining us online, we'll begin our live service here in just a moment. So thank you.